Some inheritances are measured in millions, others in billions, but there's one inheritance that transcends money entirely. An inheritance so profound, so universally valuable that it changed the course of human history forever. And the family that received it, they didn't inherit a company, a fortune, or an empire.
They inherited the intellectual property of the greatest mind the modern world has ever known. This is the story of Albert Einstein's family, and the unimaginable legacy left behind when genius itself became an inheritance. You know Einstein? Everyone does. The wild hair, the iconic photograph with his tongue out, the equation that even people who've never studied physics recognize, E equals mc squared. He's the face of intelligence itself. A man whose ideas didn't just advance science, but fundamentally rewrote our understanding of reality. Time, space, energy, matter. He saw connections no one else could see. He thought in dimensions most people can't even imagine, but here's what most people don't know. When Albert Einstein died in 1955, he left behind more than theories and equations. He left behind rights, image rights, licensing agreements, intellectual property that would generate millions, even billions in the decades to come. His face would appear on merchandise, in advertisements, in movies and documentaries. His name would become a brand, a symbol, a business, and someone had to inherit that. So who were the people closest to Einstein? What did they receive when he passed? How much was his legacy actually worth in financial terms? And perhaps most intriguing of all, what happened to the family of a man who valued ideas over possessions, knowledge over wealth, and curiosity over everything else? This isn't a story about a typical inheritance. There were no sprawling estates, no billion-dollar corporations, no fleets of luxury cars. But what Einstein's family did inherit was something far more rare, something that continues to generate value, influence, and fascination more than 70 years after his death. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand this inheritance, you need to understand the man. And to understand the man, you need to know the family that shaped him and the family he left behind. Albert Einstein was born on March 14, 1879 in Ulm, Germany, into a middle-class Jewish family. His father, Hermann Einstein, was an engineer and businessman who co-owned an electrical equipment company. His mother, Pauline Koch, came from a wealthy family and was a talented pianist. They weren't aristocrats. They weren't poverty-stricken. They were comfortable, educated, and ambitious for their children. But young Albert, he didn't fit the mold. He was slow to speak as a child, leading some to worry about his development. He clashed with the rigid, authoritarian style of German schooling. He asked uncomfortable questions. He challenged assumptions. He thought differently. And while that made him frustrating to teachers, it was precisely that refusal to accept conventional thinking that would later make him a revolutionary. Einstein's early life was marked by movement. His family relocated to Italy when their business struggled. Albert stayed behind briefly to finish school, but eventually joined them, renouncing his German citizenship to avoid military service. He was stateless for years, a wanderer, a thinker without a country, which perhaps made it easier for him to think beyond borders, beyond traditions, beyond the limits others accepted. He struggled to find academic positions early on. After graduating from the Polytechnic Institute in Zurich, he took a job at the Swiss Patent Office. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't what he'd dreamed of, but it gave him time to think, time to work on his own theories while evaluating other people's inventions during office hours. And in 1905, during what's now called his miracle year, Einstein published 4 papers that would change physics forever. One explained the photoelectric effect, which would later earn him the Nobel Prize. Another proved the existence of atoms. A third introduced special relativity. And the fourth gave us E equals mc squared, showing that mass and energy are interchangeable. He was 26 years old. Fame didn't come immediately, But over the next 2 decades, as his theories were tested, validated, and celebrated, Einstein became more than a scientist. He became a global icon. By the 1920s, his lectures drew massive crowds. His opinions on politics, philosophy, and human rights were sought after. He was invited to speak at universities, governments, and public forums around the world. He was no longer just a physicist. He was a public intellectual, a moral voice, a symbol of human potential. But fame comes with complexity, and so does family. Einstein married twice. His first wife, Mileva Maric, was a fellow physics student, brilliant in her own right, though history has often overlooked her contributions. They had 2 sons together, Hans Albert, born in 1904, and Eduard, born in 1910. There was also a daughter, Liesel, born before their marriage in 1902, whose fate remains one of history's mysteries. She either died in infancy or was given up for adoption. Einstein himself rarely spoke of her. The marriage to Mileva deteriorated. Einstein was consumed by his work, emotionally distant, and by some accounts difficult to live with. They divorced in 1919. In the settlement, Einstein promised Mileva the money from his anticipated Nobel Prize, which he hadn't yet won but was confident he would. He won it 2 years later, and he kept his word. Shortly after the divorce, Einstein married his cousin, Elsa Lowenthal. She had 2 daughters from a previous marriage, and she provided stability, managing his public life while he focused on his research. Elsa died in 1936, and Einstein never remarried. By the time World War II loomed, Einstein's Jewish heritage made him a target. He left Germany in 1933, never to return. He accepted a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, where he would spend the rest of his life. He became an American citizen in 1940. He lived modestly. He walked to work. He wore the same style of clothes to avoid wasting mental energy on trivial decisions. He played the violin. He sailed. He thought. And when he died on April 18, 1955, at the age of 76, the world mourned the loss of a genius. But his family faced something the public didn't see, the question of what Einstein had actually left behind, not just intellectually but legally, financially, practically. What does the family of a man who lived for ideas do when those ideas become property? Here's where the story takes a turn most people never expect. Because Albert Einstein didn't die a wealthy man, not in the traditional sense, he didn't own vast real estate, he didn't have stock portfolios or offshore accounts. He lived comfortably, yes, but simply. His wealth wasn't in possessions. It was in something far less tangible, yet ultimately far more valuable. It was in his name, his image, his intellectual legacy. When Einstein died, his estate was relatively modest. He left behind some savings, a few personal effects, his violin, his papers. But those papers, they contained decades of correspondence, unpublished notes, and scientific writings. And more importantly, he left behind the legal rights to his identity, the rights to use his name, his likeness, his quotes, and his image for commercial purposes. At the time of his death, those rights didn't seem particularly valuable. Einstein had been famous, yes, but he'd also been a private person who avoided commercialization. There were no Einstein-branded products, no endorsement deals, no merchandise. The idea of turning a scientist into a marketable brand wasn't yet common practice, but the world was changing. And in the decades following his death, something remarkable happened. Einstein's image became more iconic, not less. His face appeared on posters in college dorms. His quotes were printed on T-shirts, coffee mugs, motivational calendars. Advertisers wanted to associate their products with genius, with intelligence, with innovation. And the only way to do that legally was to license the rights to Einstein's image. Who controlled those rights? That's where the inheritance comes in. Einstein's will divided his estate among his 2 surviving sons, Hans Albert and Eduard, and his stepdaughter, Margot. But Eduard, his younger son, had been institutionalized for most of his adult life with severe mental illness. He lived in a psychiatric hospital in Switzerland and would remain there until his death in 1965. He was cared for, but he was not in a position to manage an estate or make decisions about intellectual property. Hans Albert, the elder son, was a successful engineer and professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He inherited a portion of his father's estate and maintained a quieter, more private life. He had his own family, his own career, and while he honored his father's memory, he wasn't particularly interested in commercializing it. Margot, Elsa's daughter and Einstein's stepdaughter, inherited the house in Princeton where Einstein had lived. She also inherited many of his personal papers and the responsibility of deciding what to do with them. But the most significant decision Einstein made regarding his intellectual legacy wasn't about family at all. In his will, he bequeathed all of his literary rights and personal papers to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. This was deliberate. Einstein had been a passionate supporter of the university and of the Zionist movement, not for political reasons, but because he believed in the establishment of a Jewish intellectual and cultural center. He wanted his ideas, his writings, and his legacy to serve education and scholarship. So the Hebrew University became the primary inheritor of Einstein's intellectual property. And in the years that followed, they would turn that inheritance into something no one could have predicted. A global licensing empire worth tens of millions of dollars. But how does a university in Jerusalem manage the image rights of a physicist who died 70 years ago? And how much money are we actually talking about? The Hebrew University didn't immediately understand what they had. In the years right after Einstein's death, the focus was on preserving his papers, his letters, his scientific contributions. The idea that his image could generate revenue was secondary. But by the 1980s and 1990s, something shifted. Pop culture embraced Einstein in a way that transcended science. He became a symbol, a meme before memes existed, the embodiment of genius, and companies wanted in. The Hebrew University established a licensing program. They partnered with an agency to manage the commercial use of Einstein's name and likeness, and the offers started coming in. Brands wanted Einstein in their ads. Apple used his image in their famous Think Different campaign. Baby Einstein, an educational media company, licensed his name for children's products. Clothing brands, tech companies, poster manufacturers, even luxury brands sought permission to use his face. Each use required a licensing fee, and those fees added up. By the early 2000s, Einstein's estate was generating an estimated $1 million to several $1 million per year. By 2010, Forbes listed Albert Einstein as one of the highest-earning dead celebrities, alongside figures like Michael Jackson, Elvis Presley, and Marilyn Monroe. In some years, his estate earned upwards of $10 million annually. Think about that. A man who lived modestly, who rejected materialism, who once said, "I am absolutely convinced that no wealth in the world can help humanity forward," became, decades after his death, a multi-million-dollar brand. But here's the twist. Most of that money doesn't go to his direct descendants. It goes to the Hebrew University. They use the funds to support scholarships, research programs, and academic initiatives. In a sense, Einstein's wealth is doing exactly what he would have wanted. It's funding education. It's supporting intellectual growth. It's helping the next generation of thinkers. His family, particularly his descendants, through Hans Albert, did receive some financial support and some control over personal items and lesser rights, but the bulk of the commercial empire belongs to the university. Hans Albert's children and grandchildren are alive today. They are private individuals, many of them accomplished in their own fields, but they live outside the spotlight. They are not billionaires. They are not tabloid fixtures. They are simply the relatives of a man who changed the world. And that raises an interesting question. Is this the ideal outcome? A legacy managed not by heirs seeking profit, but by an institution dedicated to the values the original genius held? Or is there something lost when a family doesn't control the narrative of their own ancestor? There's no simple answer. But what's undeniable is that Einstein's inheritance is unique. It's not about who got the mansion or who controls the corporation. It's about who gets to define what genius means, who gets to decide how a legacy is used, and whether money, even when it comes from the image of a man who shunned it, can be used for something meaningful. In Einstein's case, the answer seems to be yes. The Hebrew University has been a responsible steward. They've protected his image from misuse. They've ensured that licensing deals align, at least broadly, with his values. And they've funneled the revenue into causes he cared about. But the story doesn't end there, because managing a legacy this large comes with challenges, legal battles over who owns what, disputes over unauthorized use, the question of how long image rights last and who decides when they expire. Which brings us to the final chapter of this story, the turning point. The moment when everything could have unraveled, but didn't. In 2010, a legal battle emerged that would test the strength of Einstein's inheritance and determine the future of his commercial legacy. The dispute centered on a fundamental question: who actually owns the rights to Albert Einstein's image? The Hebrew University had been operating under the assumption that they held exclusive rights, but a company called Corbis, owned by billionaire Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft, claimed they had acquired certain rights to Einstein's image through a separate agreement. Corbis managed a vast archive of celebrity images and had licensed Einstein's likeness for various uses. They argued that they, not the university, had the authority to grant or deny commercial use of his image. The case went to court, and the stakes were enormous. If Corbis won, the Hebrew University would lose control over one of its most valuable assets. Licensing revenue would be split or redirected. The carefully managed brand that the university had built over decades could fragment. Worse, it could open the door for exploitation, for cheap knockoffs, tasteless merchandise, and uses that would have horrified Einstein himself. The legal arguments were complex. They hinged on the interpretation of contracts, the timeline of rights transfers, and the question of whether personality rights, the legal term for controlling someone's image after death, could be sold or only bequeathed. Different jurisdictions have different rules. In some places, personality rights expire. In others, they last indefinitely. After years of litigation, a settlement was reached. The Hebrew University retained primary control over Einstein's image and likeness. Corbis would continue to manage certain photographic archives, but the university would have final say over commercial licensing. It was a victory, but a hard-fought one. And it underscored just how valuable Einstein's image had become. But the case also revealed something deeper. It showed that even the most carefully planned inheritance can face challenges, that even when intentions are clear, the law is complicated, and that managing a legacy, especially one as globally recognized as Einstein's, requires constant vigilance. For Einstein's living descendants, the case was a reminder of the double-edged nature of their inheritance. On one hand, they are connected to one of history's greatest minds. On the other, they have little control over how his image is used. They are stewards of memory, but not masters of the brand. And yet, in many ways, that might be the most fitting outcome. Einstein himself was never interested in ownership. He believed in the free exchange of ideas. He opposed nationalism, tribalism, and the hoarding of knowledge. He wanted his work to belong to everyone. And in a strange, modern way, that's exactly what happened. His image, his name, his legacy, they're public in a way few others are. Managed, yes. Protected, yes. But ultimately, serving a purpose beyond personal enrichment. So where does that leave us? What's the final takeaway from the inheritance of Albert Einstein? The inheritance of Albert Einstein is a paradox. A man who lived for ideas, not money, became a multi-million-dollar brand. A man who valued simplicity left behind a legal and commercial legacy that requires teams of lawyers, managers, and archivists to maintain. A man who believed knowledge should be free created intellectual property that generates millions in licensing fees every year. But here's the thing, it works because the people managing his estate, primarily the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, have honored his values. The money generated from Einstein's image doesn't go into private bank accounts. It funds scholarships for students who otherwise couldn't afford higher education. It supports scientific research. It helps preserve historical archives. It does exactly what Einstein would have wanted, even if he never imagined his face would be on T-shirts and coffee mugs to make it happen. His direct descendants, the children and grandchildren of Hans Albert Einstein, live quietly. Some are engineers, some are academics, some have pursued entirely different paths. They carry the name, but they don't exploit it. They remember their grandfather not as a celebrity, but as a grandfather, imperfect, brilliant, absent at times, but ultimately driven by a desire to understand the universe. In contrast to many inheritance stories where wealth divides families, sparks lawsuits, and breeds resentment, Einstein's legacy has largely avoided that fate. There have been disputes, yes, the Corby's case proved that, but the overall trajectory has been one of preservation and purpose. And perhaps that's the real lesson here. Inheritance isn't just about what you leave behind, it's about how it's managed. It's about whether the people who receive it understand the responsibility that comes with it, whether they use it to build or to destroy, to honor or to exploit. Einstein's family and the institutions entrusted with his legacy chose to build. They chose to honor, and in doing so they ensured that his influence didn't end in 1955. It continues every time a student receives a scholarship funded by his estate, every time a researcher uses archives preserved with that money, every time someone sees his image and is reminded that curiosity, imagination, and persistence can change the world. Einstein once said the value of a man should be seen in what he gives and not in what he is able to receive. By that measure, his inheritance has been a success, because even in death he continues to give, not money to heirs, but opportunity to strangers, not a fortune to family, but a legacy to humanity. So, did you imagine this inheritance would be so unique that the legacy of one of history's greatest minds would be measured not in dollars hoarded, but in dollars spent on education and knowledge? That his family would choose purpose over profit, and that a university in Jerusalem would become the guardian of genius itself? This is the inheritance of Albert Einstein, not an empire, not a fortune, but an idea, the idea that even after you're gone, your values can endure, that what you create can outlive you, and that the greatest wealth isn't what you accumulate, but what you contribute. Did you imagine this inheritance would turn out this way? Leave your thoughts in the comments.